The rain had started sometime during the night. By morning, the streets of Bern carried that quiet, wet shine that made everything feel slower. Carriage wheels rolled softly across the stone roads below. Somewhere outside, two men were already arguing about bread prices, with far more emotion than bread had ever deserved. Albert Einstein opened his eyes slowly. His mind was already awake before the rest of him. The room was cold, not unusually cold, just the ordinary kind of cold old apartments collected during winter mornings. His blanket had twisted around his legs during the night, and one pillow had somehow fallen onto the floor again. That happened often. For a while, Einstein simply stared at the ceiling. A thought about time had already followed him out of sleep. Not fully formed yet, just fragments, clocks, distance, light, quiet ideas, moving slowly through his mind before the rest of the world had properly woken up. Outside the apartment window, Bern was still waking slowly. Shopkeepers dragged signs onto wet sidewalks. Somewhere below, a bicycle passed through a puddle, followed immediately by someone complaining about it loud enough for half the street to hear. Einstein listened quietly. Human beings, he sometimes thought, were capable of extraordinary intelligence. Right until minor inconveniences entered the conversation. He finally sat up, slowly rubbing his eyes. His hair already looked completely out of control. Einstein rarely noticed this himself. Other people noticed enough for everyone. The apartment around him was crowded with papers. Equations rested across tables, chairs, even the floor near the bed. To most visitors, the room looked chaotic. To Einstein, it looked organized enough, usually. He reached toward a sheet of paper beside the bed before realizing he had already been holding it in his left hand for several seconds. Einstein stared at the paper quietly, then sighed at himself. That also happened often. Across the room, yesterday's coffee still sat untouched near the window. Cold by now, completely forgotten during the middle of another thought that had seemed more important at the time. The floor creaked softly beneath his steps as he crossed the apartment. The cold air carried the faint smell of rain, old books, and ink. Breakfast was simple: bread, coffee, silence. Einstein preferred silence in the mornings. People often spoke too quickly after waking up. Questions arrived before thoughts did. Some people seemed afraid of quiet, as though a few seconds without conversation might force them to meet themselves for the first time. He stood beside the window while the coffee cooled slowly in his hands. Across the street, two men struggled to move a wooden cabinet through a doorway clearly too small for it. One man insisted they continue pushing. The other blamed the angle. Neither appeared willing to blame the cabinet itself. Einstein watched silently for nearly a full minute before one of them finally suggested turning it sideways. The cabinet passed through the doorway almost immediately. The two men stood there in silence for a moment, as if deeply betrayed by how simple the solution had been. Einstein smiled faintly to himself. There were days when observing ordinary people felt more educational than physics. Human beings had a remarkable ability to make simple things complicated, and looked surprised when simplicity quietly solved the problem anyway. He finally drank the coffee. It had already gone cold. Again, Einstein barely noticed. There had been evenings where he forgot to eat entirely, only realizing late at night when a headache arrived to remind him that the human body expected occasional cooperation. His landlord found many things about him strange: the late-night violin playing, the stacks of papers, the way he sometimes walked past people without noticing they had spoken to him at all. To Einstein, these things felt normal enough. To everyone else, he often seemed slightly disconnected from ordinary life. Not rude, just elsewhere. He buttoned his coat slowly before preparing to leave the apartment. One sleeve had been repaired badly several months earlier and still pulled awkwardly near the wrist. He kept meaning to fix it properly. He also kept forgetting. Outside, the streets of Bern carried that same quiet rain-soaked calm. Horses pulled carts through narrow roads, while water dripped steadily from rooftops above. A woman stood beneath a shop awning, fighting unsuccessfully with an umbrella that seemed determined to become part of the weather itself. Einstein passed people quietly. Most barely noticed him. That would have surprised future generations. At this point in his life, Albert Einstein was simply another man walking to work through the rain with untidy hair and too many thoughts in his head. Nobody stopped him in the streets. Nobody asked for photographs. Most people who passed him that morning would forget, seeing him entirely before the day had ended. Einstein probably would have preferred it that way. As he walked, the same thought returned again, quietly, persistently. What would the world look like to someone traveling beside a beam of light? The question had followed him for weeks now, not constantly, just often enough to disturb the edges of ordinary life, like hearing part of a melody repeatedly, without ever reaching the end of it. A carriage rolled past too closely beside the sidewalk, sending rainwater across the lower half of his coat. Einstein stopped walking, looked down quietly at the water soaking into the fabric, then slowly looked toward the carriage disappearing farther down the street. For a few seconds, several deeply uncharitable thoughts entered his mind regarding human awareness. He kept them to himself. The patent office appeared through the rain a few minutes later, quiet, ordinary, almost disappointingly normal for a place history would later speak about so often. Inside, the building smelled faintly of damp coats, dust, and paper that had been handled too many times. Clerks moved between desks carrying stacks of documents with the exhausted focus of people already counting the hours until evening. Einstein removed his coat slowly, water still dripping from the sleeves. One of the clerks glanced toward him. Late again. Einstein looked calmly toward the clock on the wall, then back at the clerk. Technically, he said, that depends entirely on how one chooses to measure time. The man stared at him for several seconds. Einstein continued walking before the conversation could become longer. That also happened often. He sat down at his desk while rain tapped softly against the windows nearby. Patent applications already waited in uneven stacks across the table. Strange inventions. Mechanical devices. Complicated ideas explained by people absolutely convinced they had changed the future forever. Most had not. Some barely appeared capable of surviving basic contact with reality. Einstein began reading quietly through the first set of documents. A machine intended to improve milk storage. A complicated electrical device. Something involving clocks that seemed far more confident than practical. Around him, conversations drifted slowly through the office. Complaints about weather. Complaints about money. Complaints about train schedules. Human beings, Einstein thought, could survive almost anything except mild inconvenience. A man across the room spent nearly 5 full minutes explaining why his chair felt slightly uneven. Einstein listened longer than necessary, mostly out of curiosity regarding how far the discussion might actually go, farther than expected. Apparently, for a brief moment, he considered solving the problem mathematically just to end the conversation faster. Instead, he returned quietly to the papers in front of him. By midday, the rain outside had softened into a steady gray mist. Thin streams of water slid slowly down the office windows, while the city beyond them blurred into movement and shadow. Einstein leaned back slightly in his chair, then reached into his coat pocket for a small folded notebook. This notebook mattered more to him than almost anything else in the room. Inside were scattered equations, unfinished thoughts, and strange questions that followed him through the day like unfinished conversations. Some pages were neat. Others looked as though he had been arguing directly with the paper itself. One sentence had been circled several times. Already, what would happen if two observers experienced time differently? Einstein stared quietly at the words. Around him, the office continued normally. Pens scratched across paper. Footsteps crossed the hallway. Someone nearby coughed with such dramatic intensity, it sounded almost professionally rehearsed. But his attention had already drifted elsewhere, toward something larger, something just beyond clear understanding, but close enough now to feel. That was the frustrating part about thinking. Most people imagined ideas arriving suddenly, like lightning striking a tree. For Einstein, they usually arrived slowly, quietly. An idea would sit inside his mind for weeks before finally revealing its shape. Like a figure appearing little by little through heavy fog. He often understood the feeling of an idea before understanding the idea itself. One of the clerks approached his desk near the end of the afternoon. Einstein looked up slowly. "You're smiling again." Einstein blinked once. "I am?" The man nodded. "You only do that when you stop paying attention to the real world." Einstein glanced down at the notebook, still resting in his hands, then toward the rain sliding across the windows beside the office. "To be fair," he said quietly, "the real world has been behaving very strangely lately." The clerk stared at him uncertainly, clearly trying to decide whether this was humor, philosophy, or the beginning of another conversation he did not have the energy to survive. He eventually gave up trying to understand the comment and returned to his desk with the quiet expression of a man accepting defeat on behalf of ordinary society. Einstein watched him leave for a moment, then smiled faintly to himself again. That happened often too. People usually expected intelligence to look organized, predictable, easy to follow. Einstein had never felt particularly close to any of those things. By the time evening arrived, the office had grown quieter. One by one, clerks gathered their coats and disappeared into the wet gray streets outside. Desks emptied. Footsteps faded. Einstein remained seated near the window, absent-mindedly turning a pencil between his fingers while the last light of the afternoon dissolved. Slowly behind the rain clouds, the question still had not left him. Time, light, motion. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell echoed across the city. Einstein listened carefully as the sound faded into the rain. Most people heard bells and thought about schedules, meetings, responsibilities, passing of another hour. Einstein heard something stranger. He wondered whether two people, moving differently through the world, truly experienced that same moment in exactly the same way. The office had almost emptied by the time Einstein finally stood from his desk. Outside, Bern had already begun fading into evening. The rain still lingered lightly over the city, turning the street lamps outside into soft blurred circles against the wet roads. Einstein slipped the notebook carefully back into his coat pocket. He treated it with more care than most of the official documents surrounding him. Some of the ideas inside still felt impossible. Others felt dangerous. Not dangerous in the ordinary sense. Not violence. Not destruction. More in the way certain thoughts quietly changed how a person saw reality. Afterward, Einstein sometimes wondered if truly understanding the universe came with a cost. The deeper his thoughts drifted into time and light, the stranger ordinary life occasionally began to feel afterward, as though everyone else had continued standing still, while his mind kept walking farther into fog. He stepped outside into the cold evening air. The city felt quieter now. Carriages moved more slowly through the streets, and the rain had softened into something barely stronger than mist. A warm yellow, light spilled from the windows of cafes nearby. Laughter drifted faintly through the glass whenever doors opened. People gathered inside speaking about work family, politics, ordinary things that seemed to anchor them comfortably to the world around them. Einstein often envied that simplicity, not because he believed himself above ordinary people, at least not entirely, but because his mind rarely stayed quiet long enough to simply exist inside a moment without trying to understand it. Even now, walking through the rain, part of him remained trapped inside the same question from earlier. Time, motion, observation. The universe had started feeling less solid lately, less fixed, as though reality itself depended strangely on where a person happened to stand while looking at it. A violin melody drifted faintly from somewhere farther down the street. Einstein slowed slightly as he listened. The sound was imperfect. A few notes arrived too early, others too late. Still, there was honesty inside it. Music fascinated him for the same reason physics did. Beneath all the noise and emotion, both seemed to follow invisible structures ordinary people could feel without fully understanding why. By the time he reached his apartment building, the streets had grown almost completely quiet. Rainwater still dripped softly from rooftops above, repeating the same delicate rhythm against the stone roads below. Einstein climbed the stairs slowly, one hand trailing absent-mindedly along the wall while his thoughts continued drifting elsewhere. Halfway to the apartment, he stopped suddenly. He had forgotten the bread. Again, Einstein stood silently on the staircase for several seconds, staring somewhere toward the floor with the tired expression of a man betrayed by his own memory for perhaps the 5th time that week. Then, quietly, he laughed to himself. For someone who spent so much time thinking about the structure of the universe, he seemed remarkably incapable of remembering basic groceries. Human intelligence, he suspected, was not distributed as evenly as people liked to imagine. Inside the apartment, the cold had settled deeper into the rooms. Einstein lit a small lamp near the desk, and warm yellow light slowly spread across the papers scattered around him. Shadows stretched softly against the walls. Outside the window, Bern continued dissolving into night. For a while, he simply stood there in silence. Coat still on, notebook still in his pocket, thoughts still moving, always moving. Eventually, he removed the notebook again and sat near the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass while he turned through pages crowded with equations, sketches, and unfinished thoughts written faster than his handwriting could comfortably survive. Some lines were crossed out, so aggressively they looked personally insulted. Others had been circled repeatedly, as though he already sensed something important hiding inside them. Einstein reached for his violin quietly, without fully realizing he had done it. His thoughts were still somewhere else entirely. Music often helped when his mind became too crowded for words. The first notes filled the apartment softly, calm, uneven in places, human. Outside, the city continued sleeping beneath the rain, completely unaware that one quiet man in a small apartment was slowly beginning to change humanity's understanding of time itself. The melody drifted slowly through the apartment, while rain continued tapping against the windows beside him. Einstein closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the music to carry his thoughts somewhere quieter, not away from the questions. Those never truly left him anymore, but music softened them, gave them space to breathe without demanding immediate answers. Sometimes that was enough. When the final note faded, the apartment became quiet again. The kind of quiet that felt deeper after music had existed inside it moments earlier. Einstein rested the violin carefully beside the desk and looked back toward the notebook waiting near the lamp. The pages seemed almost impatient now, as though the thoughts inside them had continued moving even while he played. In some ways, they probably had. He opened the notebook once more, turning slowly through pages filled with clocks, measurements, trains, equations, fragments of ideas written during sleepless nights and distracted afternoons. most people around him saw separate things: time, distance, motion. Einstein had started feeling they were somehow connected beneath the surface, in ways the world had not fully noticed yet. That feeling refused to leave him alone. Outside, the rain finally began slowing. The streets below grew quieter with each passing hour, until even the distant sound of carriage wheels became rare. Bern was falling asleep. Einstein was not. The lamp beside the desk flickered softly while he continued writing, occasionally stopping, occasionally staring into space for long stretches of silence that would have looked completely unproductive to almost anyone else in the world. They would have been wrong. Somewhere near midnight, Einstein leaned back slowly in his chair and looked toward the dark window beside the desk. His reflection stared back faintly through the glass. Tired eyes, untidy hair, ink stains on his fingers. Nothing about him looked extraordinary, and yet, hidden quietly inside the notebooks scattered around that small apartment, were ideas that would someday travel farther than the city sleeping outside his window ever could. Einstein watched the rainwater sliding slowly down the glass. Somewhere far below, a final carriage crossed the empty street before disappearing into the dark. Most of the world would wake tomorrow exactly as it had the day before. Same streets, same routines, same understanding of reality. Einstein had a strange feeling that this would not remain true forever. He simply did not know yet that history was already beginning to move quietly around him. Eventually, the exhaustion reached him, not suddenly, more like a slow agreement between body and mind that the night had gone on long. Enough. Einstein closed the notebook carefully and rested one hand over the cover for a moment. The questions inside it were unfinished, the ideas incomplete. But they were getting closer now. He could feel that much. Outside, Bern slept beneath the fading rain, while inside the small apartment, the future waited quietly among scattered papers and cold coffee. Einstein finally stood from the desk and moved slowly toward the bed. The apartment had grown colder during the night. Somewhere behind him, the lamp still glowed softly across the scattered equations covering the room. Tomorrow would likely look ordinary to everyone else. Another rainy morning. Another day at the patent office. Another quiet man walking through the streets with untidy hair and a distracted expression. But some ordinary days changed the world silently. Einstein lowered himself onto the bed slowly, already feeling the exhaustion settle deeper into his body now that the thinking had finally paused. For a few moments, he simply listened. The rain, the quiet apartment, the distant sound of water moving through the streets below. Then, gradually, his eyes closed, and somewhere inside the darkness beyond sleep, time continued moving, waiting patiently for him to understand it. By morning, the city of Bern would wake again, without realizing anything had changed. Shopkeepers would open their stores. Clerks would complain about weather and schedules. Carriage wheels would roll across the same wet streets below his window. And Albert Einstein would quietly continue thinking about light. The world still believed time was simple then, fixed, identical for everyone. It would not believe that forever. And years later, people would speak his name with the kind of certainty usually reserved for mountains, oceans, or stars. His theories would travel across classrooms, laboratories, books, and generations of minds not yet born on that quiet rainy night in Bern. But none of that existed for him. Yet, for now, there was only the rain, the notebook, the violin, and one man, lying awake in the darkness, listening carefully to a universe that still sounded slightly out of tune. Somewhere beyond the apartment window, the first light of morning had already begun touching the rooftops of Bern again. Quietly, patiently, another day was waiting for him. Another walk through rain-soaked streets. Another desk covered in inventions. Another 1,000 ordinary moments surrounding thoughts that were anything but ordinary. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. Sometimes it sits quietly in a small apartment, beside cold coffee and scattered papers, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. And perhaps that was the strangest part of genius. Not the equations, not the discoveries, not even the way history remembered the name afterward, but the fact that, while extraordinary ideas were slowly forming inside his mind, life around him continued almost completely normally. People still argued about bread prices, still complained about chairs, weather, schedules, umbrellas, and late trains. The universe was changing quietly, while the world remained busy being human. And somewhere inside that ordinary human noise, Albert Einstein kept listening for something deeper. A pattern, a truth, a quiet connection hidden beneath time, light, motion, and the strange experience of simply being alive. He did not fully understand it yet, but he would. And long after the rain over Bern had faded into history, the questions that followed him through those silent nights would continue echoing through the world forever. For now, though, the city remained quiet. The apartment remained cold. And one tired man, with ink on his fingers and too many thoughts in his mind, slowly disappeared into sleep while rainwater continued sliding softly down the windows beside him. Outside, Bern kept moving through the night exactly as it always had, completely unaware that the future was already awake inside one small room above its streets. By morning, the notebooks would still be scattered across the desk. The coffee would still be cold. The repaired sleeve of his coat would still pull awkwardly near the wrist. Small, ordinary things, easy to ignore, and yet hidden quietly between those ordinary moments. Albert Einstein had already begun changing the way humanity would understand reality itself, not loudly, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, like a thought arriving before the rest of the world was ready for it. And somewhere beyond the rain, beyond the sleeping city, beyond the quiet apartment filled with scattered papers and fading candlelight, time continued moving softly through the night. But for now, the city was asleep. And slowly, Albert Einstein closed his eyes too. Good night.